Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Foresight is 2020, Assessing Opportunity and Disclosing Transition Risk for a Net Zero Future. I'm Verena Radulovic, I'll be your host today and your moderator. I'm our Vice President of Business Engagement at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, which is otherwise known shorthandedly by our nickname C2ES. C2ES is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization, and we're committed to advancing climate solutions and the technologies and policies to promote them. And we do that by advancing business action on climate through our Business Environmental Leadership Council, which is a group of 40 Fortune 500 companies that are committed to addressing climate change through reducing their own emissions and making investments in low carbon technologies. We also bring together stakeholders in different perspectives and sectors to build common ground through our Climate Innovation 2050 initiative and other efforts that are really looking at how do we advance strong, smart climate policies that really get us to a decarbonized net zero future. Now today, as more companies are beginning to disclose their climate-related financial risks and opportunities in response to an interest from both investors and regulators, they still need improved guidance and best practices to help them measure and assess these risks and opportunities under different scenarios. And that's what we're going to focus on today. I also am keenly aware of the fact that we keep hearing in the news that the proposed rule from the SEC is going to be coming out soon. So this webinar is also quite timely in terms of looking at how companies are approaching their transition risks. And by transition risk, what we're really talking about is things like stranded assets, reputational impacts, regulatory changes, and a lack of market access, each of which may impact companies differently as they face a shift towards a decarbonizing future. Yesterday, C2ES released a report titled Emerging Practices in a TCFD Aligned Climate Risk and Opportunity Analysis and Disclosure. That's quite a mouthful. But really what that looks at is how are companies measuring, assessing, doing something about, and then disclosing both their transition and physical risks, as well as their climate-related opportunities. So the report looks at both the physical and transition risks. Today in our webinar, we're going to be discussing the approaches to transition risks and opportunities alone. We'll talk about physical risks, how companies are assessing those risks next week on our webinar on March 15th. But this is the idea of looking at transition risks is also important as we look at the policy developments as well as the investor commitments in support of a net zero and resilient future. A few housekeeping items before we really get started. There will be an opportunity for the audience to ask the panel questions throughout the webinar. We want this to be a dynamic conversation, so please send in questions as they come up for you in the chat, and we will do our best to address them throughout the discussion, and I will do my best to leave about 10 to 15 minutes towards the end for audience questions. We are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube site pretty soon. We usually try to put them up within 24 hours, so it'll be up soon. I'd like to now introduce our guests. We're really lucky to have two distinguished guests today who are way more knowledgeable about this topic than I am. The first is Curtis Ravenel, who is the founding member of the Secretariat, the TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. He is also a senior advisor to the co-chairs and vice chair of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, otherwise known as GFANZ, which he'll be talking about. And then we are lucky to have with us Fiona Wild, who is Vice President of Sustainability and Climate Change at BHP, which is the Australian-based mining company. So since we have a lot to talk about and we only have an hour, what we're going to do today is I'm going to start with Curtis. We're going to talk about some of the work that he's doing. Then I will shift to Fiona. She'll talk about how BHP approached its transition risk report. And then we'll open the floor up for questions and we'll have some discussion. So with that, let's go ahead and start with you, Curtis. What would be great is if you can provide an overview of the TCFD. We have a lot of folks that are on this webinar. Many of them know about the TCFD, but there are some that are newer to the space. Tell me a little bit about the TCFD, and particularly, how has the response to it evolved since it was released in 2017? What's been the response from the investor community and publicly traded companies alike?
Well, first of all, thanks to C2ES for having us. You guys are great partners and have really helped us and provided us some very useful connectivity to your members, who we really learn from and help inform the TCFD as it's evolved since its release. So thank you for your partnership. So just a very quick 101 on the TCFD. I always try to emphasize the fact that it's actually the FSB TCFD. It's the Financial Stability Board, which for those of you that are not in the financial sector, you might not be as familiar, is basically a product of the G20. It's the regulators and treasuries of the G20 countries who were brought together in the midst of the financial crisis to try and avoid future financial crises. And back in 2015, Mark Carney was chair of the FSB and of course, the Bank of England governor. And he and the G20 actually asked the FSB to look at climate risk as a potential financial risk. It's systemic. Now, our group is not comprised of people that are supposed to determine whether there's systemic risk in the system. But what I think the FSB wisely recognized was we don't have the information that we need in order to make that assessment. And so we want to create a private sector led task force, sort of for the market, by the market, we like to say, made up of practitioners from not only different geographies, but different sectors and different disciplines. So you've got chief investment officers, you've got chief risk officers, you've got sustainability people, accounting people, both from the financial and non-financial, from, big resource intensive firms and from all representing the G20 countries. And we basically locked, as Fiona well knows, we locked ourselves as she's a member. And Fiona, you need to put that on your title, member of the TCFD. We locked ourselves in a room for like 9 months and hashed this out. And frankly, it's a little heresy for me to say, but I'll say it anyway. TCFD didn't really create anything terribly new, in my view, as far as the content goes. I think there were two primary reasons for success, or maybe a few. One is we created a framework that was readily consumable by senior management and the boards, meaning we created these sort of, 4 primary areas of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. Like, that's not a climate specific thing. That's how you run your business. Because the thesis was we didn't want to create another siloed activity within an institution, but rather we wanted them to use their existing structure and integrate climate considerations into it. We all know that anyone who's in any of those roles knows that people are far too busy to have yet a whole separate process. The point was integration, and therefore it needed to sort of meld itself. So that was a consumable construct, I like to say, for people to get their heads around how you do it. The second reason I think it was successful is we wrote, frankly, we used business terms that people understand. And it was not about sort of climate speak at business. It was more about from the business perspective and how and why this is important and how you think about it. And lastly, it didn't hurt that we were FSB mandated and that Mike Bloomberg and Mark Carney, two very well respected people in the business and financial worlds, were at the head of it. And so I think we were able to take really good work that C2ES and many others in the field have been doing for a very long time and create some competency, I think, within a much broader, due to those individuals, Mike and Mark and Mary as well, Mary Shapiro, who's head of the Secretariat of the TCFD and vice chair of that, really could amplify it out. Now, I've worked on, and I'm sure many of you on the phone have, on more initiatives than I can shake a stick at. I don't think we ever expected the TCFD to be as successful as it has become, but I think for the reasons that I explained earlier, plus the fact that, good ideas, time has come, it really, these risks that people often talked about as far off in the future kept getting nearer and nearer and nearer and making this more relevant. So, because it's an FSB mandated, because we, I think, wrote in a clear way, and Fiona was very meticulous in her editing as well. We hit a chord. It resonated with people as something that was immensely doable. We were also really primarily principles based. We weren't overly prescriptive. This is very sector specific, geographic specific, business model specific. And so you can't, if you're overly prescriptive, it's just not going to fit. And because of that flexibility, and that we signaled quite clearly, I think, that this was a journey, and that the best thing to do is get started, we were able to get a lot of traction. So let me talk about one key issue, and this segue was, I would say the one thing that we did sort of elevate that had been not really part of the climate disclosure piece at this time, although some people have been working on it, was this idea around the resilience of your business strategy in plausible future states, or i.e. is the people call it scenario analysis, but it's not really scenario analysis, right? It's really about using scenario analysis as a tool to help you identify risks and opportunities in multiple plausible, not probable, future states. So it could be a 4-degree world or a 1.5-degree world or something in between. The point is your business positioned to thrive in any of those future states? That really touched off quite a bit of intense thinking, and firms like Fiona have been in the lead in that. She was really instrumental in shaping that piece of the recommendation. But like all things, when you develop it in a room full of 32 people over about a 9-month period, once we put it out into the wild, we got a lot of feedback from people trying to implement it, who helped us realize we needed to do further work. And so since we launched in mid-2017, we put out a series of supporting papers, around risk management. The recommendations themselves are, despite the booklet being this thick, the actual recommendations are not that long, and people wanted more. They wanted to see case studies. They wanted to understand, how this works in practice and so forth. Same with scenarios. So we did multiple papers on those. And then most recently, we released an updated metrics, targets, and transition plan guidance to support the TCFD recommendations. Again, the recommendations are quite high level. And that last piece of guidance was important, because what we had heard from folks was we hadn't really solved this comparability issue, and that the metrics world was still the Wild West. That was because we didn't think we were a standard setter, but we did sort of further refine and created what I was at least internally calling super categories of metrics that manifest themselves differently in different sectors, but are similar across sectors and even geographies. And so we recommended a series of metrics, primarily around carbon emissions, some CapEx, OpEx, a bit around potential carbon pricing and target setting. The field, for those of you who've worked in it for a while, you realize it never sits still. It evolves. We needed to evolve with it. And so we put out further guidance on that. To support all that also is this concept of the transition plan. We talked a lot about transition risk. We talked a lot about scenario analysis and how you identify the risks and opportunities, but we had really not yet commented on sort of what are the core good elements of a credible transition plan. And I'll, again, be candid here and say, we set the table for that. TCFD, I think, is good at setting the table. We think there are others better positioned to sort of evolve these things. And so GFANS, you can look at GFANS as kind of the next evolution of TCFD, in that we're really taking a harder look at transition plans and if you're looking at, if TCFD is scenarios and business resilience, GFANS is what's your net zero plan, and what are the key components of that plan, and how are you going to disclose and report against that? So I think there's a real connectivity there. As you know, the European Commission, the UK government, a number of other governments, and now even the SEC are all using the foundation of the TCFD to write their own rules and regs on this. We're working with all of them. I think there will be alignment with the various regulations that come out. They won't be exactly the same, which is always annoying for an issuer. but it is directionally similar, and there's a lot of work being done between those organizations to make sure that there's some consistency there and an alignment. And I would expect the SEC, as we discussed, Marina, to come out really soon with at least their draft proposal. And I would ask those of you on the phone to please, it's going to be really important for them to hear from the business and financial communities on the utility of their proposals. And so I would strongly encourage you to respond to their consultation. They're looking for it. They really need that to happen. And so, TCFD, we sort of frankly knew this in the beginning, that this was private sector led. I think Mark Carney's thesis is, regulators don't know as much as the markets know, despite the fact that Mark was a regulator forever. He was also in the private sector for just as long, and he thought it would be good if the private sector took the lead in figuring out what works and what doesn't, making adjustments. And it's finally, we have over 3,000 supporters, many and growing all the time, lots of TCFD reporting, a lot of jurisdictions engaged in it. I always jokingly call the regulators Goldilocks. They're not too hot, not too cold. They don't like to be too far ahead of where the market is, but they also really don't like to be too far behind. And given the sort of, given the steep adoption curves of TCFD and the sort of knowledge and understanding of TCFD amongst senior management and boards across the world, I think and the investor demand side of it, frankly, I think they felt it was time for them to step in and try to level the playing field. And of course, you have the announcement of the IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, creating a sister organization to IASB, the International Accounting Standards Board, which the US version is FASB, creating an International Sustainability Standards Board, who is really taking the TCFD work and trying to create more of a traditional standard out of it. I'm blue in the face. I always say, we're a framework, we're not a standard. But it does need some standardization. And we were pleased personally to see that they are in the process of anyway, acquiring, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the International Integrated Reporting Council, as well as the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So there's some consolidation within the voluntary space who are bringing their expertise to bear, along with the financial reporting expertise of the IFRS. I think they're off to a pretty good start, and there's a lot of pressure. I love to see it now. The regulators are competing. Now, maybe all the issuers on the phone don't love that, but I think it's important because those of you on the phone, if you're part of C2ES, then you've been in a leadership role for a while, and having the rest of your industry, step up and report, I think it's going to be important.
Awesome.
I stop there.
Curtis, I'm going to ask one question. Thank you. This is a great overview. I'm going to ask one question before we shift to Fiona. Making that connection between, and I think you did it very well just now, but making that connection between the TCFD and the framework for understanding risk, the idea of a transition plan, which sort of builds on that, and then the lens that GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, has. Can you clarify for those that are listening in, does GFANZ come at it from the lens of the investor? So very similar to the Financial Stability Board created this framework because investors wanted to know what the risks were in their portfolios, but really it's the companies that are also then now using TCFD to report to their investors. What is the lens that GFANZ is applying, in part because a lot of the investors themselves have these net zero financing goals? If you can talk about that for a bit, that would be great.
Well, again, I don't know if this is good or bad luck, but GFANZ also, the idea that at Glasgow that we'd have 40% of the private financial sector committing to net zero targets. That's 40%, 450 firms, 130 trillion have pledged, they've got a ways to go, have pledged to be net zero by 2050 with interim targets by 2030 and a credible transition plan to support it and reporting progress against it every year and their fair share using, science aligned sectoral pathways. It's a big deal. I think there's a little bit of a leap of faith, to be honest with you. But you have every major financial institution, for the most part, has now signed up for this commitment. Clearly, that will have an impact on the firms that they invest, underwrite, and lend to. And so that is very much the financial perspective. And it's interesting because the structure of GFANZ is complicated, and I won't bore you with the details, but on one hand, we're sort of grounded in the Race to Zero, which is a UNFCCC initiative to try to get all of the economy to align to a net zero future. And then on the flip side, we also do have a reporting relationship with the FSB. We weren't created by the FSB, but when 40% of the financial world signs up for something, the FSB wants some visibility into what's happening there. And so the TCFD, I make an argument that you couldn't have GFANZ without TCFD, because TCFD is really about understanding and reporting on your physical and transition risk and opportunities. A natural extension to that, and this gets a little complicated, is, okay, and Fiona will remember this because there were some TCFD members that had been pushing some of this consideration, like we should ask for net zero plans. This is back in 2016, like the world was not ready for that. This is an extension of TCFD. I don't think you can develop a net zero plan, a transition plan, unless you've done the hard work of TCFD to identify those risks and opportunities within your business. And that only then can you be informed of a plan. This is different than TCFD in a little bit though, because it's twofold. TCFD was very focused on financial materiality. This was about financial disclosure. It was about the risks the companies face in the face of climate. Net zero is kind of twofold. It is about financial institutions creating their own transition plans to not only to respond to the risk, but also to actually drive a net zero future. And that is different. That is intent in a way that's we're a bit more agnostic on the TCFD side.
Right.
This is much more, has a lot more intent, frankly. And that probably is reflective of the it's both risk and opportunity, but also like, how do we drive impact? And so it's really, the financial community can't do this alone. I think there's some expectations that finance is going to change the world. We all know it's not really them. They're a reflection of the real economy. They need their counterparties, the companies that they lend, underwrite, and invest in. They need to work with them to transition. They need to work together. They need to provide the financing basically for these firms to transition. But they also need regulatory support or legislative support, depending on the policy environment is not set up to help financial and real economy players deliver at this time. Maybe closer in Europe and other jurisdictions, but we have quite a long way to go. There's a yawning gap between all the jurisdictions that have committed to net zero by 2050 and then what policies they've actually enacted to support that transition. And so part of the reason it is a financial lens on GFANZ is we want to have a clear, consistent voice from the financial community on what we expect from regulators to help us do this. And also to speak consistently to the corporate community about what financial institutions are expecting of them when it comes to their own transition plans. So we don't want an asset manager telling Fiona one thing and having her insurance company saying another, and yet the bank saying another. And so how do we make sure those groups, because GFANZ is really a bunch of subsector alliances, Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance, Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, Net Insurance Alliance, and so on. How do we make sure that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? So I could go on and I'll stop there.
No, that's super helpful. And I just want to say that, one of the things in the report that we issued yesterday, we also issued a tip sheet, kind of a guidance document that was really kind of synthesizing the metrics and transition plan guidance that TCFD issued in October. We kind of took that and really kind of synthesized it and sort of added our findings from when we looked at how companies were disclosing their opportunities. So very aligned there. Thank you to TCFD for putting that out. That was really helpful. And then also to your point about net zero plans. I mean, we're seeing a lot of companies that really have set their net zero targets and are trying to figure out how they implement them, going forward. So
can I make one last point?
Yeah.
please note that one of the other announcements of COP26 was the UK plans to implement mandatory transition planning in 2024. So that's coming. This is all political insider stuff, but generally a G7 and G20 country doesn't like to be alone. So they're going to be lobbying their counterparts to do the same. And they have a task force right now. GFANZ is working on its own vision of what a good transition plan for financial institutions look like and what they expect. It'll feed into that process. From what we hear, Gary Gensler has transition planning in his document. How far that'll go, what are the conditions for whether or not you should report it. So this is quickly, I mean, the one problem maybe TCFD has really created some momentum, and I don't think it's a static thing. And so you're going to see the field evolve faster in the next 5 years than you saw it in the last 5 years, is my prediction. I'd be curious if Fiona agrees with me.
Yeah. Well, with that, let's go ahead.
Hopefully not.
Let's turn to, thank you so much, Curtis. Now I want to, so much we can talk about here. So Fiona, I'm going to shift to you to provide an overview of BHP's assessment of its transition risk and really specifically what it learned when it assessed itself against a 1.5-degree scenario. So I'll let you take it away.
Awesome, thanks. And Philip, if you can just bring up the slide pack, that would be fantastic. And just for those in the audience, the slides will be available afterwards. So very happy for you to take a look through these if there's any questions that you have afterwards. And thank you very much to C2S for inviting me to join. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And as Curtis knows, I love to share what BHP is doing. So this one is for Curtis. Here's our latest report, Curtis, BHP's Climate Transition Action Plan, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So just a bit of background on me. I started life as a climate scientist back in the 1990s, went to work at BP for about 12 years on climate and environment policy, and then moved over to BHP about 12 years ago. So BHP is the world's largest mining company. And I was also, like Curtis, a founding member of the TCFD. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we identify, assess, manage, and disclose our risks and opportunities around climate change, and what can we learn to provide that sort of high-level guidance for financial and non-financial sector players. The things I'm going to talk about specifically today, I'm going to talk a bit about how we identify and assess our climate-related risks and opportunities. I'm briefly going to talk about the work we do in terms of reducing emissions. I'll just sort of briefly touch on that. And then particularly I'll focus on how we disclose our position and performance and how we developed our Climate Transition Action Plan, which came out about 6 months ago. Next slide, please. There's the usual disclaimer. If you have extremely good eyesight, please feel free to read it. Otherwise, we'll move on to this slide. Thanks, Philip. So climate is a material risk for BHP. And there are two main types of risks to which we're exposed. Using the TCFD language, we talk about this in terms of transition risks and also in terms of physical risks. We're not talking so much about the physical risks today, those acute and chronic risks that we see playing out, but we are looking at transition risks, and they fall into a number of different categories. Things like changes in policy that we might see, changing legal and regulatory frameworks, technology development and how that might impact the production and use of products and services, and also societal expectations, both in terms of thinking about how our community might be responding to issues around climate change, but also, as Curtis has mentioned, the investor community and how expectations there are changing. Now, these things are not necessarily new. We've been dealing with these types of risks for a very, very long time in the corporate sector. And so when we think about identifying transition risks, we want to make sure we use the company's existing risk management framework. So you don't want to create a separate risk approach for climate-related risks and opportunities, but you want to think through the nature of the risks and opportunities that climate change is posing to the organization that you're working with. And when we think about this at BHP, we think about it in terms of current risks, but also in terms of emerging risks. So those things we can't quite yet quantify or get our hands around, but we have an inkling that they're just around the corner. So it's important to have a think about them in those two different categories. Generally, what we find when we look at climate-related risks is that it's very hard to identify a category of risks that are climate-related in that sense. So there's not sort of pure climate risk. What there is impact of climate change on almost every other single risk that you will have identified in your organization. So the way I think about it is that climate change almost acts as a sort of volume knob, and it turns up the dial on all the other risks that you've already identified. It acts as an amplifier. So originally, when we were looking at climate risk, we thought we'd have a separate category and all of these climate-related risks would sit underneath it. What we actually found is that climate is one of those pervasive risks that, as I mentioned, really amplifies other risks and opportunities that you might already have. So that tends to be how it plays out when you look at it through that risk management framework. Next slide, please. In terms of our approach to climate, as you may be aware, we've been thinking about climate for a long time, like many other emissions intensive sectors like oil and gas and mining, of course. We've been thinking about this since the late 1990s, where we started to report on our emissions, set targets to reduce our emissions. But over time, our approach has really expanded. It's broadened and deepened to make sure we think about the science of climate change, the implications for our operations, our supply chains, our communities, our investments, our portfolio, and the ecosystems that support what we do. So really, this issue about climate-related risk has broadened and deepened over that sort of 30-year period. And you'll see here on the bottom right-hand side of the slide, the Climate Transition Action Plan for 2021, which is what I'll talk about a little bit later. The picture just next to it is the first report we put out, which was back in 1999. So it's been a real evolution over that period. Next slide, thanks, Philip. So I'm going to talk a bit about scenario analysis. And as Curtis mentioned, this is really one of the core disclosures or core recommended disclosures from the TCFD. What you really need to be able to do is have a good way of bringing the outside in. So what are the implications of the response to climate change and the impacts of climate change on your strategy, your portfolio, and your value? But you also need to be able to work out the signal from the noise. There's an enormous amount of information available, an increasing amount of information coming through. But how do you work out what's important and what's not? What we find is that scenario analysis is an extraordinarily useful tool for doing this. And we've been using it for quite a while. We started looking at this in terms of transitions to 2 degrees. So thinking about what would both an orderly and a more rapid transition to 2 degrees mean for demand for BHP's commodities, but also in terms of the overall value of the company. More recently, we actually assessed a broader range of scenarios. So we looked across at the resilience of the portfolio from 1.5 degree world, so increasing the global average temperature increase of 1.5 degrees, all the way through to a +3 degree world, and thinking through what that would mean in terms of demand and value for the company. What was really surprising for us in that scenario analysis that we did with those, I think we had 4 different scenarios in the end, and you'll see them here. What was really surprising to me was that BHP did best in a decarbonizing world. Now, I guess it was surprising because internally inside the organization, we'd always had that sort of slightly uncomfortable trade-off of, well, it feels like there's a kind of business as usual option, and then there's the option where you're trading off value for action on climate change. What we actually found in this 1.5 degree scenario that we did was that there is an amazing alignment between decarbonization and value generation. And the minute you can identify that, the rationale for action is incredibly clear for everybody across the organization, and the momentum that it creates in the system is extraordinary. The reason that we saw this for the 1.5 degree scenario for BHP, as you can see here, is that, for example, in a 1.5 degree world, copper production is likely to double over the next 30 years, and nickel production has to increase about 4-fold. And this is for things like electrification and the increase in use of batteries. But we also saw that we could see the importance of iron ore and metallurgical coal to support development of renewable technology and decarbonization enabling infrastructure. So in the 1.5 degree scenario we looked at, the world is expected to need almost twice as much steel in the next 30 years as it did in the last 30. Now, you may say, well, did you create a scenario that worked really, really well for BHP? No, we created a scenario that was relevant to BHP. And this is the really important thing. So I think you have to create scenarios that are relevant to your strategy. Really what scenario analysis is about is saying, what are the assumptions that you have that underpin your strategy? What do you just assume is always going to be the case, which will always generate value for the organization? Then you have to ask yourself the question, could climate change impact those assumptions? And if so, how? How would it do that? So you create scenarios where those assumptions are upended. And then you ask yourself, what happens? And then you have to think about how could you tell if those things were starting to happen? And then what would you do if you saw those things happening? So effectively what you're doing is you're really testing the underlying assumptions that the organization sits on and understanding what would happen if the response to climate change or the impacts of climate change played out and what it might do to those underpinning assumptions. And that's why developing a scenario which is relevant to you and to your company and to your strategy is so important, because you know what those assumptions are that are underpinning the strategy and investment decision making inside the organization. In terms of practical steps, things that have worked really well for us, the first thing was involving a whole range of people in the scenario analysis process. This isn't something that my team developed with a kind of nirvana view of what we wanted the world to look like. This is something that had to be based on the recommendations and the insight of a whole range of different teams. The value of doing that is that you end up with a whole of company response, because everybody's been through the process of understanding what the range of outcomes could look like, which means everybody effectively has kind of skin in the game when you get to the end point. The second thing I would say is you don't necessarily have to start with the end point of quantitative analysis in mind. One of the things that's really helpful with scenario analysis is understanding directionally what matters. So does a particular change have a positive or a negative impact? And is it big or is it small? That's enough to get you started. It doesn't have to be a really complex macroeconomic analysis. It could simply be directionally, is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? And in terms of materiality, is it a very good thing or just a slightly good thing, or vice versa? And as I mentioned, there is no one size fits all, because the nature of the risks varies by company, by sector, by jurisdiction, and over time. And the assumptions that underpin your strategy are different to the assumptions that underpin other people's. So it's really important to create scenarios that are relevant for your company. I'll just move now to capital alignment. This is the next slide. Thanks, Philip. We spent a lot of time over the last year or so thinking through how we can demonstrate how capital is being aligned with the scenarios and forecasts that we have inside the organization. In our financial statements, we now describe the two scenarios that are used as inputs to our operational planning. And these are based on our current estimates of the most likely range of futures for the global economy and its associated subsystems. Now, these operational planning ranges are periodically reviewed to reflect new information, and they do impact judgments and estimates that management is required to make in the preparation of our financial statements, including things like the determination of valuation of assets, potential impairment charges, the estimation of remaining useful life, the depreciation purposes, the timing of closure and rehab, and the recoverability of certain tax assets. But what we're trying to do at the moment to enhance our current approach, which is shown on the slide here, is to systematically integrate one or more of our 1.5 degree scenarios into our strategy and capital prioritization processes. So not just looking at it as a kind of test at the strategic level, but following these impacts of a 1.5 scenario all the way through to the way that capital is allocated at the assets. And that's something that we're looking to hopefully get finished by the end of our financial year 2022. One of the other things we did in 2021 around capital alignment was to review potential approaches to the measurement and classification of green revenue. So it's a phrase that gets bandied around in various different jurisdictions. And effectively, it's meant to be a measure of the extent to which products and services contribute to the transition to a green economy. But there's no settled methodology of what it really means or how it might be applied. So we applied an approach to green revenue based on end use, and we used two of our products, nickel and uranium, by way of illustration. Obviously, battery manufacturing uses nickel, so that was a very important contributor to climate change mitigation. And Australian uranium is only sold for nuclear power generation, which of course is a lower emissions source of electricity. So we disclosed the amount of green revenue that we believe we produce as a result of these two particular products, but importantly, we also disclosed the methodology that we use, and we open that up to investors and others to critique and provide feedback on. And we intend to continue doing that in 2022 with the aim of trying to establish really clear methodologies for the classification and measurement of green revenue, but also to work with our customers, suppliers, and others to really improve traceability of our products in the value chain, which can be extremely difficult, and to understand the emissions that are really produced by their use. I'll very quickly turn to what we're doing to reduce emissions. That's the next slide, because I'm conscious that I'm probably talking slightly too much. I won't labour this too much, but effectively when we're thinking about decarbonisation, we need to look at decarbonising our operational emissions, or decarbonising our operations, and also decarbonising our value chain. Operational emissions are generally more straightforward because you have the levers at your disposal to reduce those emissions because you have operational control. We had short-term targets in place since that fancy report from the 1990s. So we used to set 5-year targets to reduce our emissions. What we realized a few years ago is that we needed to give both our employees and our investors and other stakeholders a much clearer line of sight to our decarbonisation trajectory. So we also put in place medium-term targets and long-term targets. So we now have a short-term target which covers 5 years. We have a medium-term target that goes out to 2030, and we have a long-term goal of net zero by 2050. And that's been really helpful in helping us explain the decarbonisation pathway for BHP, but also helping us to plan, because in order to decarbonise in our sector, we need long lead times. So we need to give the business an indication of where we want to get to. In terms of our emissions at BHP, it's predominantly electricity, use of diesel in these enormous trucks that we have, but we also have fugitive emissions, and they are in our kind of hard to abate category. So about 20% of emissions come from those hard to abate sources. And so we're prioritizing structural abatement for electricity and diesel emissions, but we're also looking potentially at the use of offsets in the longer term to address those hard to abate emissions like fugitives. One other thing I would say is in our capital allocation framework, we now rank climate change related projects alongside maintenance capital. So this is absolutely core to the way that we allocate capital, and it comes ahead of growth projects. And it's more than an aspiration. So we have a clear and committed plan for emissions reductions, with capital expenditure expected of between about 100 and 200 million per year. But effectively, there's no gap between what is identified as climate spend and other spend over time, because what we find is that as your strategy aligns with this 1.5 degree world, all spend is climate related spend. So it's increasingly difficult to kind of identify climate related spend and kind of partition it off as being different to capital spend in general. And that really, I think, is the ultimate outcome, where every decision, every allocation of every dollar is made with a view of managing climate related risks and opportunities. Next slide, please. I'll just touch very briefly on value chain emissions. This is very challenging for BHP because our value chain emissions are about 25 times higher than our operational emissions, and about 90% of them come from downstream of BHP's operations. So this is about our customers' processing and use of our products. So it's a complicated area for BHP, but again, like we did with operational emissions, we've set targets and goals to reduce our scope 3 emissions. So we have a net zero scope 3 goal for 2050, and we have hard targets in those parts of our value chain where we can currently see a credible pathway for them to be achieved. Particularly for us, that's around our suppliers' emissions and also the emissions in the maritime sector. Steel results in a very significant portion of our downstream emissions, and at this stage, we can't see a pathway for the global steel sector to get to net zero by 2050, and neither can many others, including the IIGCC. So So at this stage, we haven't set a hard target for steel emissions, but that's something we continue to look at. And there's a considerable amount of work going on inside BHP to really help elucidate that pathway to net zero for steel and catalyse some of the activity that can help to bring it forward. Next slide, thanks. I might actually just skip over this one so we get to the disclosure slide, if that's okay. Perfect, thanks. So I mentioned earlier on that we've had a really strong commitment to transparency and disclosure for decades. And so we've been doing it for a long time, but the nature of disclosure has significantly changed over that time period. It's become much broader and much deeper as time's gone on. Interestingly, when I talk to investors and say, what sort of information do you need? The answer is still often, I don't really know, but I'd like lots of it. And that's quite difficult to manage when you're thinking about what are we measuring, what are we reporting, what are we disclosing? And what we're moving towards doing is putting all of our information into financial accounts. So we put all of our TCFD disclosures into our financial accounts back in 2017. So I kind of figured if you're a member of the TCFD, you should probably be reporting in line with the recommended disclosure. So we went a bit early on that one. But it is quite difficult. It's particularly difficult when you need to determine financial impacts in line with accounting principles. This is still very much an evolving area of work. The other area you have to be really careful about is legal risk. So we need to be very careful that we have a reasonable basis for the disclosures that we make and that our actions are backing up our words. So we're not saying one thing, but doing something else. In the last couple of minutes, I'll just talk about the Climate Transition Action Plan, which is the document you can see at the bottom right of this slide. And this was released in September 2021. So I'll talk about it in a bit more detail. If you could just go to the next slide, please, Philip. So the Climate Transition Action Plan was designed specifically to align with the structure of the Climate Action 100 Plus Net Zero Company Benchmark, which you may be aware was established in late 2020. And this gives you an indication of how fast things are moving. So we actually released our previous report 3 months earlier, but the net zero company benchmark was released 3 months after that report, and it became the standard for disclosure. So we needed to make sure we were reporting in line with the current standard for disclosure. And what it does, this Climate Transition Action Plan, is it provides an update on our performance in a format that really reflects evolving investor assessment and disclosure frameworks. So it uses this net zero company benchmark approach, and it provides more detail on some of the key indicators of that benchmark. So it looks at scope 1 and 2, scope 3, capital alignment, and the just transition. What we decided with our Climate Transition Action Plan was also to use it as the basis for a Say on Climate vote. And the Say on Climate approach has been bubbling up probably for about the last year or so. And again, we thought it was worth developing this plan, but also testing this approach, this Say on Climate approach, which is sort of generated from the Say on Pay discussions that have happened a few decades ago. So we put forward our Climate Transition Action Plan to our AGMs in 2021 as the basis for the Say on Climate vote. It was an advisory vote, and it was really designed to allow shareholders to discuss and provide feedback on our climate strategy. The good news is that we got really strong shareholder support for the report. We got an 85% vote in favour, so really strong endorsement of our approach. What this means is we feel like we have a seal of approval to move forward with our approach on scope 1 and 2, scope 3, and those other areas I mentioned. But we do need to continually report on our progress, and we'll do that on an annual basis. And we intend to hold a Say on Climate every 3 years to make sure that we're really hitting the mark in terms of our response to climate change. Last slide, please, Philip. So in summary, as I've mentioned, the nature of transition risks continues to change. So you have to keep up to date with what's happening in the science, the economics, the technology, the policy, and the societal expectations. The issue is here to stay, but the focus areas you'll be looking at will change. Scenario analysis really holds the key to understanding risk and opportunity and building resilience. Mitigation is obviously essential, and it's increasingly focused on net zero for operations. and for the value chain. We're seeing increasing interest from stakeholders. And so you need deep analysis, but you also need deep and ongoing engagement to make sure that you're responsive to the needs of the audience. And most importantly, make sure that what you say lines up with what you do. And with that, I'll pass back to Verena.
Oh, thank you. There's so much we could talk about. And there's a number of questions that are coming in. So I think what I'll do is I'll ask a few questions of Fiona and then a few more for Curtis, or both of you can kind of address those. So Fiona, you mentioned we had a question coming in, and I will say that we have a variety of companies on the line. We've got utilities, car companies, we have tech companies. So different sectors are obviously going to face different challenges under different scenarios. So with the different scenarios, you did talk a little bit about how you allocate capital. Is there, and so from what I understood, is there a sort of weighting, like how you weight the different scenarios, or do you just sort of allocate capital towards climate, and then depending on the scenario, if it, if it gets hotter, if the temperature dials up, you fare differently? So if you can just kind of speak to that a little bit more in terms of, and then how do you weight the different, how do you weigh the different scenarios to allocate capital, and then what do you tell your investors or potentially regulators, like which scenarios you're using?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So generally speaking, when we're looking at scenarios, we don't ascribe probabilities to scenarios. And generally that's the way scenario analysis is done. So you don't say, well, here's one particular scenario, and I think it has a likelihood of 10% versus here's another which has a likelihood of 90. Effectively, what you're saying is you have your forecast of what you think is the most likely outcome. I'm doing this because I'm imagining this is global average temperatures, unfortunately, and it's going up. So this is what you think is most likely to happen. But what you need to build is a range of scenarios that are plausible but divergent. And so when you're making an investment decision, you're making a decision based on what you think is going to happen, which is your forecast, but you're testing it across this really broad range, because what we know is we cannot tell the future. So you want to be able to make a decision which has been tested across this plausible but divergent range of scenarios, which means that if your forecast does not come to fruition, which it probably won't because we're not great at telling the future, you've actually got a sense of if it's anywhere within this operating envelope, you can start to think through what the impacts are going to be. And importantly, because you've done the scenario analysis, you can check to see which of these scenarios might be becoming more or less dominant. And you can actually work out how you would respond. So what you do for each scenario is you develop a range of signals and signposts, and you track them on a regular basis. If you start to see more of these things happening, you say, okay, this scenario is actually becoming more dominant. So my forecast is probably going to start shifting a little bit closer to this scenario that I identified. And then it means that when you're actually allocating capital aligned with that forecast, it's reflecting what you're seeing in the outside world. So it's not about ascribing probabilities. It's about making sure that when you're making decisions, you make decisions that are robust across that range of plausible but divergent futures.
And to build on that, I know that we glossed over the policy slide because we're running out of time, but we'll make the slides available so people have them. But sure. when BHP found that in the 1.5 degree scenario, you guys did pretty well. What does it mean then if we sort of track backwards? So you've got this, you're agnostic about the scenarios, and you have signposts, which I think is really important. And I think that could be its own webinar of diving in. What do those signposts look like so people can understand in real time on an annual basis where you're allocating capital? But then talk to me about how once the company says, oh, wow, we do really well in 1.5. What does that mean in terms of policy advocacy, or like saying, hey, you know what, we actually really would love the world to go, towards 1.5. What do we as a sector do, or as a company do? Can you talk about that internal conversation that you're having either with yourself or with your colleagues, and what that looks like?
It's really interesting actually, because it changes, well, it changes the way you think about policy advocacy. So what we need to do as an organization is understand what policy measures will enable us to decarbonize more quickly, but also what policy measures will enable the world to decarbonize more quickly. Because in terms of value for our shareholders, we want to see that decarbonization happen. So we need to focus on advocating for the measures that are most material to BHP, but also what it drives is a really clear catalytic role for a company like BHP. So we cannot single-handedly deliver a 1.5 degree outcome, but there are things that we can do in the value chains where we operate that can actually make that outcome more likely. So what it drives is not just policy advocacy for the measures that can support BHP's transition, but policy advocacy for the measures that can drive sectoral decarbonisation. But it's also, I think, incredibly important not for BHP to be passive and say, well, we'll just wait and see what happens. We actually have to do something which makes that outcome more likely. And so that's why you see things like BHP working with really, really large steel makers around the world to enable them to decarbonise their operations. So we have partnerships in place with 4 really significant steel makers now that represent about 12% of global steel production, where we're investing in their operations and their value chains to enable them to reduce their emissions. So it's that catalytic impact that you can have. It's not just about thinking, what do I do to reduce my emissions? It's what do I do to support sectoral decarbonisation so that that 1.5 degree outcome becomes more likely over time.
Excellent. I wish we had more than 3 minutes left, but I'd like to bring Curtis back to the screen, and I'm going to ask either Curtis or Fiona to answer this one question. You know, when we look at all this work that's been done, a lot of it is industry driven, voluntary, and we see potential regulation coming into this. Curtis, maybe if you can speak to, you know, where does potential regulation really fit into this discussion, and where can policy regulation really help drive some of the drive or accelerate some of the work that we're seeing, for example, like a company like BHP having undertaken?
Well, as we all know now, Fiona is perfect at her job and has done an amazing, amazing work with BHP. I do like to tease her. She does have one advantage, which is that they are a diversified company. And because of that, they have capacity across different scenarios, and they can dial it up and down as they check those milestones along the way. Not every company's like that. And so she does have a structural advantage there. I always, it's important to note that. But it's a good point. Is your business resilient to plausible future states? And if you are, solely focused on resource intensive or emissions intensive assets, it's going to be harder for you. There's no question. Now, the regulators, look, again, I'll just repeat what I said earlier. The regulators, I think it's become time for them. I think it's appropriate that they've stepped up at this time. Let's just hope they don't muck it up. And so if they use the TCFD as their sort of guiding light, hopefully they won't. But it's kind of unfair that Fiona and other leading firms have been doing all this on their own, and others who are not engaged in this voluntary effort haven't. And this is a systems-wide problem, and we need systems-wide visibility into where companies are on their journey. And so I think it's really important. On the policy side, I mean, I said the rhetoric and the action. I mean, it's a lot like what Fiona was talking about with her company. It's great to set all these targets and stuff, but how do you measure progress against those? And what is she actually doing on capital allocation and other things that help support that, proposed way forward? I haven't seen that with countries yet. And I'll pick on the US. They've made a net zero commitment, but without Build Back Better, you're not going to get the grid electrification that you need to support that transition. So you really need, as an example, that kind of policy support. You can't expect these for fiduciary reasons, asset operators, owners, and investors to do this voluntarily if the economics aren't there. And so policy needs to come in to support the economics.
Excellent. Thank you. I did want to give one last question, building on what Curtis just said. Is there, from a perspective from a company like BHP, from BHP, is there guidance or resources that the government can develop, or that policymakers or regulators can develop that can assist more broadly the experience that your company had, for example?
I wouldn't like to talk about the Australian climate policy environment. Right. For those of you who've looked at this, it's a
lot like ours.
Yeah, it's long and torturous. I mean, as people always talk about policy certainty, I don't expect policy certainty, but I would like to have a framework in place where you kind of know, broadly speaking, where you're heading and what the rules of the game are. So we know, broadly speaking, where we're heading from a policy perspective. I mean, the net zero ambitions of companies of countries are very clear now. it would be really good to have the kind of the rules of that process put in place. It doesn't have to be prescriptive. It's like Curtis said about the TCFD. This is about principles. It's about those long-term objectives. But we need some boundaries to work within because it allows us to plan. And that's the most important thing I think that we can do.
Curtis and Fiona, thank you so much, both of you, today for joining us. For those that were listening in, this will be available online on our recording. We'll share the slides, and hopefully this is the start of not just this conversation, but the start of a much longer conversation across different sectors. So thank you to both of you for your time today.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.